The year of our Lord, 1887, was a harsh one. The sun over the western territories was not a gentle giver of life, but a blacksmith's forge, beating down on the plains until the earth cracked like old leather. It was a land of stark, unforgiving beauty, where the horizon stretched on forever, interrupted only by the jagged teeth of distant mountains or the skeletal remains of a lightning-struck cottonwood. Life was stripped to its essentials: water, work, and faith. And for most, that faith was as hard and unyielding as the land itself. Towns like Harmony Creek were little more than desperate prayers against the wilderness, a collection of unpainted wooden buildings huddled together as if for warmth against the vast, lonely expanse. There was a general store smelling of coffee beans, cured leather, and dust, a saloon that was loud on Saturday and silent on Sunday, and a church whose stark white steeple seemed to point an accusatory finger at the heavens. Law was what the sheriff said it was, but order, true order, was dictated by a stricter code. It was a code written in the clipped nods of men and the lowered gazes of women, a set of unassailable truths about duty, decency, and the sacred bond of matrimony. Marriage was not a matter of the heart. It was a contract, a cornerstone of survival. A woman's virtue was her currency, and a man's word his bond. To stray from these paths was to invite not just gossip, but ruin. And then there were the storms. They came with little warning, monstrous things of wind and dirt that turned the midday sky to a bruised twilight. They scoured the paint from houses, stole hats from heads, and filled every corner of a man's home and soul with a fine, gritty layer of the wilderness he was trying so desperately to tame. Jedediah Jed Stone knew the loneliness of this land better than most. His small ranch was tucked away at the edge of the Blackwood Forest, a place where the endless plains finally gave way to the deep. Silent shadows of pine and oak. The cabin was sturdy, built with his own hands from timber he'd felled himself, every notch and joint a testament to his solitary labor. He had a few dozen head of cattle, a stubborn patch of corn, and a silence that had settled deep into his bones. 5 years prior, that silence had been filled with life, the laughter of his wife, Mary, and the small, insistent questions of his son, Thomas. Then came the fire. It wasn't a wild fire, a grand act of nature, but a small, stupid accident, a lantern knocked over in the barn. By the time he'd gotten the horses out, the flames had licked their way to the house. He remembered the smell of burning pine and something else, something sweet and terrible that haunted his dreams. He remembered the silence after the screaming stopped. He had been left with nothing but the scorched earth and the ranch he had intended to build for them. Now, he worked from before sunrise to long after sunset, driven by a routine that left no room for thought, no space for the ghosts to gather. He was a quiet man, his words as sparse as the rain, his face a landscape carved by sun and sorrow. The storm that night was a bad one. It came not as a wave of dust, but as a fury of water, a violent tantrum of the heavens. Rain fell not in drops, but in sheets, driven sideways by a wind that screamed through the eaves of his cabin like a banshee. Jed sat by his hearth, the fire casting flickering shadows on the rough-hewn walls. Listening to the assault, he was worried about the new calf, born just 2 days ago. Its mother was skittish. Pulling on a heavy oilskin coat, he lit a lantern and stepped out into the maelstrom. The wind nearly tore the door from his hand. Bending his head against the deluge, he fought his way toward the barn, the lantern small, golden eye cutting a feeble path through the roaring dark. The horses were restless in their stalls, their eyes wide and white. The cow was lowing nervously, but the calf was safe, nestled in the clean hay. As he turned to leave, a flash of lightning split the sky, illuminating the world in a stark, instantaneous photograph of white and black. And in that brief, brilliant moment, he saw it, a heap of sodden fabric and pale skin near the corner of the barn, half hidden by a rain-flattened thicket of sagebrush. His first thought was a cougar had gotten a stray calf, but the shape was wrong, too delicate. He moved closer, his boots sinking into the mud. The lantern light fell upon the form. It was a woman. Her hair, the color of dark honey, was plastered to her face and shoulders. Her dress, a fine blue silk that had no place on a ranch, was ripped at the shoulder and hem, and stained with mud. A long, ugly gash ran across her forehead, blood mingling with the rain on her pale cheek. She was shivering uncontrollably, her eyes closed, her breathing shallow. For a moment, Jed stood frozen. It had been years since he had been this close to anyone, let alone a woman in such distress. Then, the years of solitude and self-reliance took over. He set the lantern down carefully, knelt in the mud, and gently touched her shoulder. "Ma'am?" Her eyes fluttered open. They were a startling shade of green, like moss in a shaded creek, and they were filled with a raw, animal terror. She flinched away from his touch. "It's all right," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "You're safe. You need to get out of this storm." He didn't wait for an answer. With a grunt, he slid one arm under her shoulders and the other beneath her knees. She was lighter than he expected, a fragile weight against his chest. She made a small sound, a half-sob, half-gasp, but didn't struggle as he carried her through the blinding rain and into the warmth of his cabin. He laid her down gently on the bearskin rug before the fire, the heat immediately beginning to draw steam from her wet clothes. He fetched a clean cloth and a basin of water from the stove, his movements economical and sure. Kneeling beside her, he began to gently clean the wound on her forehead. She winced, her hands clenching into fists at her sides. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice low, trying not to spook her. She watched him for a long moment, her green eyes wide and searching in the firelight. Her lips trembled as she spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "Eleanor?" "Jedediah Stone," he offered. "Folks call me Jed." He finished cleaning the cut and pressed the cloth to it to stymie the bleeding. The silence in the cabin was a living thing, punctuated only by the crackle of the fire and the howl of the wind outside. Her dress was ruined, and clinging to her in a way that made him feel a flush of heat that had nothing to do with the fire. He turned away, busying himself by finding one of his own clean flannel shirts and a thick wool blanket. "You need to get out of those wet things," he said, his back still to her. "You'll catch your death. I'll turn around." He set the shirt and blanket on a chair near the fire and moved to the far side of the small, single-room cabin, staring resolutely at the chinking between the logs. He heard the rustle of wet fabric, a soft sigh. The air grew thick with a tension he hadn't felt in years. It was the tension of another presence, another life breathing in his space. When she spoke again, her voice was a little stronger, but laced with an urgent plea. "Thank you," she whispered. He heard her wrap the blanket around herself. "Please, if anyone comes looking, don't tell them you found me." Jedediah turned slowly. She was sitting up, wrapped in his blanket, his oversized shirt peeking out from the top. The firelight played across her face, softening the harshness of the cut and the exhaustion in her eyes. The fear was still there, but now it was tempered with a sliver of hope, a hope that was directed entirely at him. He saw the faint outline of a bruise blooming on her cheekbone. He saw the desperation. He was a man who understood desperation. He simply nodded. "No one comes out this way much. You're safe here." He didn't ask what she was running from. The torn silk dress, the title of a bride, she'd whispered in a feverish mumble while he carried her. The terror in her eyes. It all painted a picture he didn't need colored in. Out here, a woman running from a marriage was a woman running from a life sentence. He gave her his bed, a simple cot in the corner, and took the bearskin rug by the fire for himself. For the first time in 5 years, the cabin did not feel empty. It felt dangerously, terrifyingly full. The storm passed, but Eleanor stayed. The roads were washed out, and her ankle, she claimed, was too swollen to walk on. Jed didn't question it. He fell into a new routine. He would rise before dawn, milk his cow, and leave a pail of fresh milk and a plate of Johnny cakes on the small wooden table before heading out to mend the fences and tend to his stock. When he returned at midday, he would find the cabin tidied, the scent of his meager provisions cooked into a simple, savory stew. They rarely spoke. The cabin was too small for secrets, yet theirs hung in the air between them. In the quiet evenings, he would sit on one side of the hearth, mending tack or sharpening a knife, and she would sit on the other, watching the flames, her hands folded in her lap. But in that shared silence, something began to grow. It was in the way her eyes would follow him as he moved about the room, a quiet, intense observation. It was in the way he started leaving wildflowers, purple asters and Indian paintbrush, in a tin can on the table. He learned the topography of her face, the slight cleft in her chin, the way her brow furrowed when she was thinking, the scattering of freckles across her nose that the firelight turned to gold. He noticed the strength in her hands, hands that were clearly not used to work but were deft and sure as she helped him shell peas or patch a tear in his shirt. One evening, he returned from the fields, his hand bleeding from where it had been snagged on a run of barbed wire. Before he could even reach the water basin, she was there, taking his hand in both of hers. Her touch was gentle, her fingers surprisingly cool against his rough, warm skin. As she carefully washed the dirt from the wound, her head bent in concentration. A strand of her dark honey hair fell across her face. Without thinking, he reached out and tucked it behind her ear. His calloused fingertips brushed the soft skin of her temple. She froze. Slowly, she looked up, her green eyes meeting his. The air crackled, the world outside, the chirping crickets, the rustling leaves, the vast, lonely night, faded away, leaving only the two of them in the golden bubble of lamplight. It was a moment of profound, unspoken communication. He saw not just gratitude in her eyes, but a deep, aching loneliness that mirrored his own. He pulled his hand back as if burned, a muscle twitching in his jaw. "Thank you," he mumbled, turning away to find a clean rag for a bandage. The delicate dance of avoidance and awareness continued, but the space between them was shrinking. The quiet, no longer comfortable, but charged with unspoken words. A few nights later, the air had turned crisp with the first hint of autumn. A fire blazed in the hearth. Jed was working on an old shirt, his brow furrowed in concentration as he tried to thread a needle, his large, clumsy fingers making the simple task a trial. He was acutely aware of her watching him. He could feel her gaze on his hands, on his face. "Finally," she spoke, her voice soft, barely disturbing the stillness of the room. "You saved me," she said. He grunted in acknowledgement, not looking up from his task. "Anyone would have—" "No," she insisted, her voice gaining a quiet intensity. "They would have taken me back. They would have seen the torn dress and the name of the man I was promised to, and they would have returned me like lost property." She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice was thick with a strange wonder. "But no man ever saw me the way you look at me now." His hands stilled. He finally looked up. The firelight caught the unshed tears in her eyes, making them glisten. She wasn't looking at him like a damsel in distress looking at her rescuer. She was looking at him like a woman seeing a man, and in that moment, he knew he was looking at her in the same way. He wasn't seeing a runaway bride, a problem, a danger. He was seeing Eleanor. He was seeing the strength that had gotten her this far, the intelligence in her watchful eyes, the deep well of feeling she kept hidden behind her quiet demeanor. He didn't know who moved first. It was as if the space between them simply collapsed. He set the shirt aside and was on his knees before her on the rug. He raised a hand to her face, his thumb stroking the line of her jaw. She leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering closed. Then he leaned in and kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion, but of discovery. It was tentative, gentle, a question asked and answered. Her lips were soft, tasting of wood smoke and a sorrow he was just beginning to understand. He felt her hands come up to rest on his shoulders, her fingers curling into the rough fabric of his shirt. The kiss deepened, the loneliness of years pouring out of him, the desperation and fear pouring out of her. It was a confluence of two solitary souls in the vast, empty wilderness. He felt a fire ignite within him, a heat he had thought long dead and buried with Mary. His arms went around her, pulling her close, his hands sliding from her jaw down the slender column of her throat. He felt the frantic pulse beating there. The blanket slipped from her shoulders, and the soft flannel of his shirt was all that separated his hand from her skin. And that is what stopped him. The thought crashed through the haze of desire with the force of a winter chill. She was vulnerable, frightened, indebted to him. She wasn't in her right mind. This wasn't a choice she was making freely. It was a choice born of desperation, and he would not be the kind of man who took advantage of that. He would not dishonor her, or the memory of the love he had lost. With a groan that was part pain and part frustration, he pulled back. He rested his forehead against hers, his breathing ragged, her eyes opened, wide and questioning, clouded with confusion and hurt. "I can't," he rasped, his voice a raw whisper. "This ain't right. Not now. You're not safe enough to make this choice." He pushed himself to his feet and stalked to the other side of the cabin, running a hand through his hair and staring out the small window into the impenetrable blackness of the night. He could feel her eyes on his back, a silent, burning question he could not bring himself to answer. The air, once charged with desire, was now thick with shame and regret. The next morning dawned bright and clear. The awkwardness from the night before was a palpable thing, a third presence in the small cabin. They moved around each other with a new, painful awareness, their gazes refusing to meet. Jed ate his breakfast quickly and escaped to the far pastures, needing the hard labor and the wide-open spaces to clear his head. He felt like a fool, and worse. He felt he had hurt her in his clumsy attempt to be honorable. He was checking a fence line late in the afternoon when he heard it, the unmistakable sound of a horse and carriage approaching on the dirt track that led to his ranch. His heart hammered in his chest. No one ever came out here. It had to be for her. Someone had found her. He dropped his tools and ran, his long legs eating up the distance back to the cabin. He burst through the trees into his clearing just as a small, respectable-looking carriage pulled to a halt. A man in a town suit was holding the reins. The door opened. Jed braced himself, ready to lie, to fight, to do whatever it took. A woman stepped out. She was dressed in a sensible traveling dress of dark green wool. Her hair, the color of dark honey, was pinned up neatly beneath a modest hat. She moved with a quiet confidence, her gaze sweeping over the small ranch before landing on Jed. His breath caught in his throat. It was Eleanor, but it wasn't. The resemblance was absolute, uncanny, down to the scattering of freckles on her nose, but the eyes were different. They held none of the hunted fear he had grown used to. These eyes were steady, calm, and filled with a weary resolve. The cabin door opened, and his Eleanor stepped out onto the porch, her hand flying to her mouth. She was wearing one of his shirts and a borrowed skirt. Her hair was loose, and the cut on her forehead was still visible. She stared at the woman by the carriage, her face a mask of disbelief and relief. The woman in the green dress looked from the woman on the porch to Jed, who stood frozen between them. A small, sad smile touched her lips. She took a step forward, her voice clear and carrying in the still afternoon air. "I'm Eleanor," she said, her gaze fixed on Jed's stunned face. Then she nodded toward the woman on the porch, the woman he had saved, the woman he had held and kissed. "That's my twin, Clara." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Jedediah's mind, accustomed to the simple, brutal certainties of weather and livestock, struggled to grasp the fractured reality before him. The woman on the porch, the one whose touch he still felt on his skin, whose scent lingered on his pillow, was not Eleanor. She was Clara, and the woman by the carriage, a stranger with a familiar face, was the real Eleanor. The name was a key, and it turned a lock in his mind, making everything that had happened in the past week feel like a dream, a fiction he had willingly inhabited. Clara, the woman he had called Eleanor, took a half-step back, her body language a study in retreat. The defiance that had carried her through the storm seemed to crumble, replaced by a quiet shame that pulled at the corners of her mouth. She wrapped her arms around herself, a gesture of self-protection, her gaze fixed on the rough planks of the porch. It was Eleanor, the newcomer, who took control. She moved with an air of practiced grace, her steps sure and measured as she closed the distance between the carriage and the cabin.
Mr. Stone,
she said, her voice smoother than her sister's, more refined.
I apologize for this intrusion and for the deception. My sister, she acts from the heart, often without considering the consequences.
She cast a look at Clara, a look that was a complex mixture of love, exasperation, and a deep, shared history.
My name is Eleanor Vance. I was a mail-order bride, promised to a Mr. Alistair Finch in Blackwater Gulch.
Jed's gaze flickered to Clara.
Alistair Finch.
He knew the name. A man with a reputation as hard as the silver mines he owned, known for his temper and his possessiveness. The pieces began to click into place, forming a picture far darker than he had imagined. Eleanor continued, her words precise and calm, as if reciting a formal statement. I was resigned to my duty. Our family has fallen on hard times. But Clara, she would not have it. She believes a woman's life should be her own. A faint, bitter smile touched her lips. A noble sentiment, but a dangerous one. Without a word to me, she took my travel trunk, my ticket, and a portion of my dowry money and ran, intending, I suppose, to lead Mr. Finch on a wild goose chase and buy me time. Or perhaps she had no plan at all. The last sentence was directed at Clara, who flinched but did not look up.
I only learned what had happened when a telegram reached me, meant for her, from a town 2 days east, Eleanor explained. She'd sold my mother's locket for funds. That's how I tracked her general direction. I hired this driver to search the homesteads along this route. I never imagined. Her voice trailed off as she took in the isolation of Jed's ranch, the stark reality of where her sister's flight had led her.
Jed felt a cold knot of anger tighten in his gut. It wasn't just anger at the lie, but at the sheer recklessness of it all. He had been made a fool of, a pawn in a family drama he had no part in. The intimacy he had felt, the kiss by the fire, now seemed cheapened, an act performed by a woman playing a role. He felt betrayed. And yet, as he looked at Clara, huddled on the porch, he felt something else, too, a grudging flicker of admiration. To run like that, to throw oneself into the maw of the wilderness, to save a sister from a fate she was too dutiful to flee herself. It was an act of incredible, reckless courage. He saw past the deception to the motive, and the motive was a fierce, untamable love. Her eyes, when she finally risked a glance at him, were not just frightened. They were burning with a desperate desire to be free, to live a life on her own terms. It was a look he recognized, for he saw a version of it in his own reflection every morning. "The horse," the driver called out, his voice gruff. "Threw a shoe and she's pulled up lame, miss, and that sky's looking mean again." Jed looked west. The man was right. The horizon was already darkening with the bruised purple of another approaching storm. The clear, crisp air of the morning was gone, replaced by a heavy, electric stillness. "You can't leave in this," Jed said, the words torn from him. It wasn't a question. It was a fact. The road, already damaged, would be a river of mud by nightfall. "The horse can be seen to. You'll all have to stay." The silence that followed his declaration was heavier than the coming storm. The driver, a pragmatic man, simply nodded and began unhitching his good horse to lead it to the barn.
For the three of them, Jed, Eleanor, and Clara, the words sealed their fate. They were trapped. 3 people, 2 faces, 1 small cabin. The space, which had once felt like a sanctuary for 2, now felt like a cage for 3. The air grew thick with unspoken resentments and uncomfortable truths. Eleanor, with an effortless grace, tried to impose a sense of civility on the situation. She unpacked a small bag of her belongings, a silver-backed hairbrush, a book of poetry, a bar of scented soap, and these small artifacts of a more refined world seemed to mock the cabin's rustic simplicity. Clara, by contrast, seemed to shrink. The woman who had filled his home with her quiet, intense presence was now a ghost, flitting at the edges of the room, her eyes downcast, her words few. She yielded the domestic space to her sister as if by right. Eleanor took over the cooking, her movements efficient and practiced as she turned Jed's simple stores into surprisingly palatable meals. She kept the cabin tidy, mended the sisters' torn clothes, and spoke to Jed in polite, measured tones, asking about his land, his cattle, the hardships of a rancher's life. She was building a bridge of civility over a chasm of tension, but it was a fragile structure. Jed found himself watching them, comparing them. They were identical in form, yet opposites in spirit. Eleanor was the calm surface of a lake, her depths hidden and controlled. Clara was the turbulent current beneath. When she thought no one was watching, he would see her gaze drift to the window, a look of such profound longing for the open space beyond that it made his own chest ache. He retreated into himself, becoming even more silent and withdrawn than before. The betrayal stung, but it was Clara's wild courage that intrigued him. He found himself thinking less about the lie she had told, and more about why she had told it. The storm lasted for 2 days, trapping them in a world of gray rain and echoing silence. When the weather finally broke, the ground was too saturated to work the fields, but the roof of his barn, he noticed, had sprung a leak during the deluge. The next morning, he gathered his tools and a bundle of fresh shingles. As he headed for the barn, a voice stopped him. "I can help." It was Clara. She stood on the porch, dressed in a pair of his old trousers she must have found, rolled up at the ankles, and one of his work shirts. The clothes were far too big for her, but for the first time since her sister had arrived, she looked like herself again. There was a spark of determination in her eye. Eleanor appeared at the door behind her. "Clara, for heaven's sake, that's not women's work. Come inside." "I'm stronger than I look," Clara said, her gaze locked on Jed. "And I'd rather be useful than sit inside and sew another seam." Jed hesitated for only a second. He remembered her hands, deft and sure when they had patched his shirt. He saw the desperate need in her to do something, to act, to escape the suffocating confines of the cabin. He gave a curt nod. "Can you hold a shingle straight?" "I can," she said, a faint smile touching her lips for the first time in days. They worked together all day under a pale, watery sun. It was hard, physical labor. Jed climbed onto the roof, tearing away the old, rotten shingles, while Clara remained on the ground, sorting the new ones and passing them up to him. They didn't speak much, but a new kind of communication formed between them. The easy rhythm of shared work. He would call down, and her hand would appear at the edge of the roof with a new shingle. He learned to anticipate her movements, the same way he knew the rhythms of his animals. He watched her from his perch on the roof. She worked tirelessly, her face smudged with dirt, her brow beaded with sweat. There was a raw, earthy competence about her that he had not seen in any other woman. She was not delicate. She was resilient, like the prairie grass that bends in the wind but never breaks. He found himself comparing her to Mary, his late wife. Mary had been gentle, a calming presence, the quiet heart of his home. Clara was a fire, unpredictable and captivating. The realization unsettled him. While they worked,
Eleanor would bring them water and a midday meal of bread and cheese. She would stand at the base of the ladder, her skirts pristine, her expression unreadable as she watched her twin sister doing a man's work with a man she barely knew. Jed could feel the invisible lines of tension stretching between the two sisters, a silent tug of war he was now standing in the middle of. That evening, they sat around the fire, exhausted and sore. The smell of tar and fresh-cut pine clung to Jed and Clara. Eleanor sat slightly apart, reading her book of poetry, creating an island of refinement in the rustic room. Suddenly, she closed her book, the sound sharp in the quiet. She looked at Jed, her expression serious. "Mr. Stone," she began. "I have a question, if you'll permit it." Jed nodded, wary. "When you found my sister, you thought she was me. You cared for her, gave her shelter. You protected her." Her gaze was direct, probing. "If you thought I was her, the runaway bride bound for a man like Mr. Finch, what made you care?" The question hung in the air, aimed at Jed but ricocheting off the silent figure of Clara, who sat staring into the flames as if she hadn't heard. Jed was floored. He had no answer. Why had he cared? Because she was a woman in distress? Because it was the decent thing to do? Yes, but it was more than that. He had seen the terror in her eyes, but he had also seen the flicker of defiance behind it. He had seen a fellow soul caught in a trap, and his own lonely, trapped existence had responded to it. But he couldn't say any of that. The words were stones in his throat. "A man does what's right," he finally managed, the answer feeling thin and inadequate even to his own ears. Eleanor held his gaze for a long moment, then gave a small, unsatisfied nod and reopened her book. But the question remained, unanswered, seeding a new and profound discomfort between them all. In the days that followed, Clara began to avoid him. Their easy rhythm in the barn was gone. If he headed for the fields, she would busy herself in the small vegetable patch behind the cabin. If he came inside, she would slip out to check on the horses. It was a careful, deliberate dance of avoidance, and it gnawed at him. He felt as if he were being punished, but he wasn't sure for what crime. For kissing her? For stopping? For looking at her now with a curiosity that he could no longer hide? One afternoon, he was trying to break a stubborn young gelding that had been spooking its shadows. The horse was green and full of fire. Jed was patient, speaking in low, calming tones, but the horse remained tense. He swung into the saddle, and for a moment, he thought the horse had accepted him. Then, a rabbit darted from a nearby bush. The gelding shied violently, bucking and spinning in a blind panic. Jed, caught off guard, was thrown. He landed hard, the impact knocking the wind out of him. Pain flared in his shoulder and along his ribs. He lay on the ground, gasping for air, the world a dizzying blur. He heard a cry, and then footsteps running towards him. Clara! She must have been watching from the porch. She knelt beside him, her face pale with worry. "Jedediah, are you all right? Speak to me." "Air," he managed to gasp. "Just knock the wind out of me." She helped him sit up. The world slowly swam back into focus. He was bruised and scraped, but nothing seemed to be broken. With her help, he staggered back to the cabin. Eleanor rushed forward, her face etched with concern. But Clara waved her off. "Help me get him to a chair. Fetch the liniment." Clara's touch was surprisingly strong as she guided him. Once he was seated, she stood before him, her hands on her hips, her initial fear replaced by a simmering frustration. "You shouldn't have been riding him alone. He's not ready." "He has to learn sometime," Jed grunted, wincing as he tried to move his shoulder. "And you need to learn you're not made of iron," she retorted. Her gaze fell on a long, raw scrape along his side where his shirt had been torn. "That needs cleaning. Take off your shirt." The command was so direct, so devoid of maidenly hesitation, that it momentarily silenced him. Eleanor hovered nearby with a basin of water, a look of uncertainty on her face.
Jed, his ribs aching, struggled with the buttons of his shirt. "Here," Clara said, her patience gone. She stepped forward and brushed his clumsy hands away. Her fingers worked the buttons with a surprising gentleness. The air in the cabin grew thick and still. Jed was intensely aware of her proximity, the scent of sunshine and earth that seemed to cling to her. As she pulled the fabric apart, her knuckles brushed against the bare skin of his chest. A jolt, like static electricity, passed between them. She drew in a sharp breath and her hands stilled. He looked up, and his gaze was captured by hers. The world narrowed once again to the space between them. The barn, the fields, her sister standing just a few feet away. It all disappeared. He saw everything in her eyes now, the guilt of her lie, the sting of his rejection, the raw hurt of being trapped, and something else, something deeper, a yearning that mirrored the hollow ache in his own chest. It was the look of a woman who wanted to be seen, truly seen, for the person she was, not the role she had been forced to play. Her eyes were glistening. She finished pulling the shirt from his shoulders and took a step back, breaking the spell. Her voice, when she spoke, was a ragged whisper, so quiet he wasn't sure Eleanor could hear. It was a confession meant only for him. "I wish," she said, her green eyes filled with a universe of pain and longing, "you'd look at me the way you looked at her." Clara's whispered words hung in the air long after she had fled, leaving Jed with the basin of water and a profound sense of dislocation. "I wish you'd look at me the way you looked at her." It was an accusation and a plea, a single sentence that laid bare the tangled knot of identity and desire that had taken root in his cabin. He had been looking at a ghost, a fiction named Eleanor, and in doing so, he had failed to see the real, breathing woman in front of him. The sting of her words was a pain far sharper than the scrapes on his ribs. The uneasy truce of the past few days was shattered. An invisible wall now stood between him and Clara, built of her hurt and his confusion. Eleanor, ever perceptive, seemed to sense the shift. Her politeness became more pronounced, her efforts to maintain a veneer of normalcy more strenuous, as if she could patch the cracks in their fragile coexistence with good manners alone. The cabin, once a shelter, had become a crucible, the heat of unspoken emotions growing more intense with each passing day. It was a week later, on a deceptively peaceful afternoon, that the outside world finally breached their isolation. Jed was splitting firewood, the rhythmic thud of the axe a familiar comfort, when his dog, a scruffy mutt named Buck, let out a low growl. Jed froze, axe in hand, and listened. He heard it then, the jingle of harnesses and the plod of several horses, coming not from the main track but from the direction of town. He straightened up, his eyes narrowing as 3 riders emerged from the tree line. They were not cowboys. The man in the lead was Sheriff Brody, a portly man whose badge seemed a size too small for his chest. Flanking him were 2 men Jed recognized as elders from the Harmony Creek Church, Deacon Miller and Mr. Abernathy, men whose piety was matched only by their appetite for the business of others. Clara appeared on the porch, a basket of mending in her hands. She saw the riders, and the color drained from her face. She looked at Jed, her eyes wide with the familiar, hunted terror he'd first seen in the storm. This was it. The world had come to reclaim its property. As the riders drew closer, Eleanor stepped out of the cabin, moving to stand beside her sister. Her face was a calm, composed mask, but her hand found Clara's and squeezed it tightly. "Stay behind me," Eleanor whispered, her voice a low, urgent command. She pushed Clara gently towards the door and then turned to face Jed, her eyes locking with his. The riders were 50 yards away. "Mr. Stone, Jedediah, they are looking for a runaway bride, a single woman. They cannot find one here." Jed's mind raced. He understood her meaning instantly. It was a desperate, dangerous gamble. "What are you proposing?" he asked. his voice rough. "I am your wife," Eleanor stated, not a hint of question in her voice. "My sister, Clara, is visiting us, helping me through a difficult confinement. That is the story. It is the only story that protects her." Jed's gut recoiled. To lie so brazenly, to claim a wife before these self-righteous men, felt like a violation of his solitary code, a desecration of the memory of the woman who had truly been his wife. But then he looked at Clara, peeking from behind the door frame, her face a portrait of pure panic, and he knew he had no choice. To hand her over to a man like Finch, or to the judgment of men like these, was unthinkable. He gave a single hard nod. "Get inside, both of you!" He set the axe down and walked to the porch. Standing at the top of the steps, as the three men reined in their horses, Buck growled, the hair on his neck ridged. "Sheriff," Jed said, his voice flat and unwelcoming. "Jedediah," Brody replied, touching the brim of his hat. He was a man who preferred to let others do the talking. It was Deacon Miller who spoke, his voice oozing a condescending sort of concern. "We don't mean to intrude on your solitude, Jedediah, but we've come on a matter of some moral urgency. Word has reached us from Blackwater Gulch. A bride, promised to Mr. Alistair Finch, has absconded. A Miss Eleanor Vance. She was last seen heading in this direction." He peered past Jed towards the cabin door. "We're making inquiries at all the outlying homesteads." Jed's stance didn't change. "There's no Miss Vance here." Mr. Abernathy, a thin, weasel-faced man, chimed in. "A young woman, traveling alone. A woman of her station wouldn't last a day out here by herself. She'd need shelter." His eyes were small and sharp, missing nothing. As if on cue, the cabin door opened. Eleanor stepped out, a hesitant smile on her face. She was wearing one of her own simple dresses, and she had twisted her hair up in a modest bun. She looked every bit the homesteader's wife. She carried a tray with 3 tin cups of coffee. "Jedediah, darling, don't keep our guests waiting in the sun," she said, her voice warm and chiding. She glanced at the riders. "Sheriff, gentlemen, forgive my husband. He forgets his manners out here." The 3 men stared, momentarily speechless. Jedediah had a wife? Since when? The news was a bombshell dropped into the quiet gossip of Harmony Creek. Eleanor glided past Jed and offered the tray to the men. "I am Eleanor Stone. It's a pleasure to finally meet some of our neighbors." Jed felt a muscle in his jaw twitch. Eleanor Stone. The name sounded alien, a falsehood that grated on his soul, but he had to play his part. He moved to her side, his body stiff and unnatural. Deacon Miller recovered first. "Mrs. Stone, my apologies. We had not heard that Jedediah had remarried." His eyes were full of suspicion. "It was a quiet affair," Eleanor said smoothly, her smile never wavering. "My husband values his privacy." She looked up at Jed, her eyes shining with a convincing adoration. "We've been hoping to come into town for Sunday service soon. I've been a bit under the weather." As she spoke, Jed knew he had to sell the lie. He forced his rigid arm to move, to circle her waist. The contact was electric. She was warm and solid against his side. Her body yielded to his touch, leaning into him slightly. As if it were the most natural thing in the world, he felt a tremor pass through her, or perhaps it was through him. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw a flicker of movement in the doorway. Clara was watching. "My wife has had a difficult time of it lately," Jed said, the words feeling like ash in his mouth. "Her sister is here from back east, helping out." Right on cue, Clara stepped out. She kept her eyes lowered, her posture submissive. "Gentlemen," she murmured. Abernathy's gaze sharpened, flicking between the 2 sisters. A striking resemblance. "We are twins, sir," Eleanor said, her hand coming up to rest on Jed's chest, a proprietary, wifely gesture. a fact that has caused no end of confusion our whole lives. Her performance was flawless. She was calm, respectable, and utterly convincing. She was the picture of a devoted wife standing by her husband. Sheriff Brody, a simple man at heart, seemed satisfied. "Well, ma'am, sorry to have bothered you. Deacon Abernathy. It seems the young lady isn't here." But the deacon's eyes were still narrowed, his mind churning. The timing was too convenient. A runaway bride named Eleanor Vance disappears, and a recluse like Jedediah Stone suddenly has a new wife named Eleanor. Still, without proof, there was nothing he could do. A man's home was his castle, even a rough cabin like this one. "We'll trouble you no longer," Miller said, his tone making it clear he didn't believe a word of it. "But know that the good people of Harmony Creek will be praying for your household, Mrs. Stone, and we will be watching." The threat was veiled, but unmistakable. They turned their horses and rode away, leaving a thick, ringing silence in their wake. As soon as they were gone, the performance ended. Jed dropped his arm from Eleanor's waist as if it were a hot brand. Eleanor's smile vanished, replaced by a look of profound exhaustion. She leaned against a porch post, her composure finally cracking. Clara, however, did not look relieved. She looked shattered. She stared at the spot where Jed's hand had rested on her sister's waist, her expression a mixture of pain and of fury so cold it was terrifying. Without a word, she turned and fled back into the dark interior of the cabin. The lie saved them, but it poisoned the air between them. The cabin became a stage, and they were all unwilling actors in a play of Eleanor's devising. In the days that followed, a strange dynamic took hold. Jed and Eleanor had to maintain the fiction, if only for themselves. They spoke to each other as husband and wife, their words laced with a brittle, false intimacy. "Darling, is the coffee ready? Jedediah, be careful with that axe." And the touches, which had begun as an act, started to blur at the edges. A hand on his shoulder as she passed him, his arm brushing hers as they reached for the same water dipper. Each touch was a spark in the volatile atmosphere, a reminder of the lie that bound them and the truth that tore them apart. Clara was the silent audience to this agonizing play. She watched everything. She saw the way Eleanor's hand lingered a moment too long on Jed's arm. She saw the way Jed's gaze would sometimes soften when he looked at Eleanor, a flicker of genuine tenderness creeping into his performance. He was a lonely man, and Eleanor was playing the part of a devoted companion with heartbreaking skill. For Clara, every one of these moments was a fresh wound. She had run into a storm for her sister, lied for her, and now she was forced to watch that same sister effortlessly claim the one thing Clara had found in the wilderness that felt like hope. A man who had seen her, truly seen her, if only for a moment. The jealousy was a physical thing, a bitter acid in the back of her throat. She would watch Jed place a protective hand on Eleanor's back when she stumbled, and Clara would have to dig her nails into her own palms to keep from crying out. She was invisible again, living in her sister's shadow. Only this time the shadow was cast by a man she was beginning to feel she could not live without. The pressure built for a week, the silence in the cabin growing heavier each day. Then the spring rains returned, a soft, persistent drizzle that turned the world outside into a watercolor of greens and grays. The rain matched the mood inside, a slow, melancholic weeping. That night, the drizzle intensified into a downpour, drumming on the roof with a frantic, relentless rhythm. A storm had broken outside, and another was about to break within. During their silent supper, Jed had reached across the table to wipe a smudge of flour from Eleanor's cheek. It was an innocent, almost unconscious gesture, the kind a real husband would make. But to Clara, it was the final, unbearable straw. She pushed her chair back, the legs scraping harshly against the floorboards. Her face was a pale, tight mask. "I need some air," she bit out, her voice trembling. Before either of them could stop her, she had thrown open the door and run out into the night,
into the heart of the storm. "Clara!" Eleanor cried, starting to her feet. But Jed was already moving. "Stay here," he commanded, grabbing his heavy oilskin coat from its peg. He didn't stop to think why he was going after her. He just knew he couldn't let her be out there alone in the dark and the rain. Not when she was in such a state. He plunged into the roaring darkness. The rain was cold, instantly soaking his hair and shirt. "Clara!" he shouted, his voice swallowed by the wind. He could just make out her shape, a silhouette standing at the edge of the clearing, her face turned up to the tumultuous sky, letting the rain lash down on her. He reached her side and, without a word, wrapped the heavy coat around her shivering shoulders. She was soaked to the skin, her thin dress clinging to her body. She didn't seem to notice the cold. She turned to him, her eyes glittering in the darkness, wild and full of a terrible pain. The rain streamed down her face, mingling with the tears she no longer tried to hide. Her voice, when she spoke, was a raw cry of anguish, loud enough to be heard over the rising thunder. "Why did you do it?" she screamed at him. "Why did you let her?" "To protect you," he yelled back, trying to make himself heard. "Protect me?" she laughed, a bitter, broken sound. "You've put me in a cage. I watch you with her, the way you touch her, the way you look at her, the way you say her name. I left everything, my home, my name, my entire life, so she could have her life, so she could be free. Now you hold her like she's yours." Her words struck him with the force of a physical blow. She was right. In his effort to protect her, he had become her tormentor. He had played his part too well. He looked at her then, not as the runaway, not as Eleanor's twin, but as Clara. He saw the fierce, brave woman who had thrown herself into the unknown for love of her sister, only to find herself more trapped than ever. He saw the woman whose raw vulnerability had called to something deep inside him. The space between them crackled with more than just the storm. It was charged with weeks of unspoken desire, of jealousy, of confusion and profound, aching loneliness. The rain, the wind, the thunder. It all faded into a dull roar in the background. All he could see were her eyes, burning with a truth that stripped away all pretense. He didn't know who moved first. It was a mutual, desperate collision. His hands came up to cup her face, his thumbs wiping away rain and tears. He groaned her name, a sound torn from the very depths of his soul. "Clara!" And then he kissed her. It was nothing like the first, gentle kiss they had shared by the fire. This was a storm, a tempest of its own. It was a kiss of raw, unrestrained hunger, of anger and desperation. It was fierce, punishing, and utterly honest. Her hands came up, tangling in his wet hair, pulling him closer. Her mouth opened to his, and the kiss was no longer a question but a furious, declarative statement. It was a release of all the tension, all the lies, all the stolen glances and forbidden thoughts. It was the brutal truth in a world of polite fictions. He kissed her with all his confusion and all his certainty, with the ghost of his wife and the phantom of her sister looking on. In that moment, there was only Clara, real and solid and fierce in his arms, her taste of rain and sorrow and a wildness that matched his own. For a long, breathless eternity, they clung to each other in the heart of the storm, two solitary souls finding a brutal, fleeting anchor in one another. Finally, gasping, they broke apart. The wind howled around them, and the rain continued its relentless assault. But the storm inside had momentarily passed, leaving a devastating calm in its wake. They stared at each other, their chests heaving, the consequences of what they had just done crashing down upon them. Neither of them spoke. There were no words for what had just happened. Silently, Jed took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers, and led her back toward the small, golden square of light that was the cabin window. When they stepped inside, dripping water onto the wooden floor, Eleanor was waiting. She was standing by the hearth, her back ramrod straight. Her eyes were not on their faces,
or on their entwined hands, which they quickly dropped. Her gaze was fixed on the hem of Clara's dress, which was spattered and dark with mud. She looked up, and her calm, unreadable eyes met Jed's, then moved to her sister's. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. She knew. Later, they sat down for a supper that no one ate. The fire crackled in the hearth. The rain drummed on the roof. The clock on the mantel ticked, each second falling like a stone into a deep well of silence. Jed stared at his plate, the kiss still burning on his lips, the guilt a leaden weight in his stomach. Clara sat opposite him, her hands clenched in her lap, her face pale and shut down. And Eleanor sat at the head of the small table, a queen of a broken kingdom, her composure a terrifying, perfect mask. No one spoke. The silence was a living entity, thick and suffocating. It was filled with the sound of a passionate kiss in the rain, with the sharp sting of betrayal, and with the quiet, shattering realization that their carefully constructed lie had just given way to a terrible, undeniable truth. The masks were off, and the raw, wounded faces beneath were finally, painfully, visible to them all. The morning after the kiss in the storm was a descent into a new kind of hell. The silence of the previous days had been a thick, heavy blanket. This new silence was a razor's edge. Every movement was fraught with meaning, every avoided glance a fresh accusation. They moved around the small cabin like ghosts, haunting the scene of a tragedy, the air thick with the memory of rain and betrayal. Eleanor was the most terrifying. Her composure had returned, but it was no longer the graceful mask of a refined lady. It was the chilling calm of a frozen river, its dangerous currents locked beneath a sheet of ice. She performed her daily tasks with a brittle, meticulous precision. The clink of a spoon against a bowl sounded like a judge's gavel. The way she folded a blanket seemed to pass a final, damning sentence. She did not look at Jed. She did not look at Clara. She looked through them, as if they were nothing more than regrettable fixtures in a room she was forced to occupy. Clara had retreated so far into herself she seemed to be shrinking. She ate little, spoke not at all, and spent her time staring out the window, her hands twisting in the lap of her borrowed skirt. The fire that Jed had found so captivating in her was gone, reduced to a pile of cold, gray ash. Jed, caught between the two silent women, felt like a man trapped in a house with collapsing walls. The guilt of the kiss was a physical weight on his shoulders. He had acted on an impulse as raw and uncontrollable as a lightning strike, and it had set their world on fire. The breaking point came 2 days later. Jed was in the barn, currying his horse, the repetitive motion a small comfort in the chaos of his thoughts. He was trying to lose himself in the familiar scent of hay and horsehide when a shadow fell across the doorway. It was Eleanor. She stood there for a long moment, watching him, her expression unreadable. He stopped his work, his hand resting on the horse's flank.
"The lie isn't working anymore, is it?"
she said, her voice devoid of emotion. It wasn't a question. Jed had no answer for that. He simply shook his head. She stepped further into the barn, the dusty shafts of light from the high windows illuminating her pale face. "You think you know what happened," she said, her gaze distant. "You think you saved a runaway bride, that Clara saved her sister from a monster. It's a simple, noble story, but it's not the true one." She walked over to a bale of hay and ran her hand over its rough surface. "I was promised to Mr. Finch. That part is true, and he is not a kind man. But the truth, Mr. Stone, the truth is that I would have married any man to get away." Jed turned to face her fully, his brow furrowed. "Away from what?" A sad, bitter smile touched her lips. "From being Eleanor Vance, from a life where every choice was made for me, from a home where I was nothing more than a pretty thing to be polished and displayed and eventually sold to the highest bidder. I was suffocating. The marriage wasn't the prison. My entire life was the prison. The marriage was just a different cell." She finally looked at him, and for the first time in days, he saw a crack in the ice. Beneath it was not anger, but a profound, bottomless sorrow. Clara thinks she ran to save me from a man, but I was running from everything. I wanted to disappear. I wanted to be no one, somewhere no one could find me. Her voice dropped to a whisper, a confession that seemed to cost her everything. I never wanted to be a bride, Jedediah. I just wanted to escape. The words struck him with the force of a physical blow. He had seen this as a drama between two sisters and a suitor, with himself caught in the middle. But it was far more complex than that. Both sisters were running. Both were trapped. He had simply stumbled into the path of their desperate, colliding flights. He saw Eleanor then, not as the calm, calculating actress, but as a woman just as lost and desperate as her twin. The confession changed nothing, and yet it changed everything. It did not absolve him of his guilt, but it layered it with a new, painful understanding. That night, the silence at the dinner table was different. It was no longer sharp and accusatory, but heavy with the weight of three separate, deeply held sorrows. The next morning, Clara was gone. She had left before sunrise, on the small cot where she slept. She had left a folded piece of paper. Jed picked it up. It wasn't a letter. It was 3 words, written in a stark, simple hand. I need air. Eleanor looked at the note, and a single tear, the first he had seen her shed, traced a path down her cheek. She wiped it away angrily, as if furious at her own weakness. Jed's first reaction was a flash of anger at Clara for her recklessness, but it was quickly replaced by a cold, gnawing fear. The wilderness around his ranch was no place for a woman alone. There were cougars, bears, and men who were far more dangerous than any beast. He felt a primal, protective urge that overrode everything else, the guilt, the confusion, the presence of Eleanor.
She'll be back,
Eleanor said, her voice tight.
She's always been the resilient one. She just needs to run until she's tired.
But Jed wasn't so sure. He gave it a day. He worked his fields, his eyes constantly scanning the tree line. He mended a fence, his ears straining for the sound of a footstep. The day passed in an agony of waiting. The cabin, with just him and Eleanor, felt cavernously empty. The tension between them had been replaced by a shared, unspoken anxiety. By the second morning, he couldn't stand it any longer. He found her tracks easily enough. She hadn't tried to hide them. They led away from the ranch, deeper into the blackwood forest. He packed a small satchel with water, jerky, and a blanket, saddled his horse, and told Eleanor he was going to find her. She simply nodded, her eyes dark with worry. He tracked her for hours. She was a ghost in the woods, her trail faint but determined. Finally, late in the afternoon, as the sun began to dip below the pines, casting long, spooky shadows, he saw smoke, a thin, gray tendril curling up into the sky. It was coming from the direction of an old line shack he knew of, a small, dilapidated cabin used by hunters in the fall, abandoned the rest of the year. He dismounted and approached on foot, his movements silent. He didn't want to startle her. The cabin was little more than 4 leaning walls and a crumbling stone chimney. But the smoke was real, and so was the faint, flickering light he could see through the single grimy window. He pushed open the creaking door. She was there. She sat on the floor before a small, struggling fire she had built in the hearth. She had a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, and she was staring into the flames, her face streaked with dirt and exhaustion. She didn't look up when he entered.
I knew you'd come,
she said, her voice flat. Jed closed the door behind him, shutting out the encroaching twilight. The small room was filled with the smell of wood smoke and damp earth. It's not safe for you out here.
Nowhere is safe,
she replied, her gaze still fixed on the fire. Not for me. He dropped his satchel on the floor and walked over to the hearth, hunkering down beside her. He was close enough to feel the meager warmth of the fire, close enough to see the deep sadness in her eyes.
Clara,
he began, his voice low.
Don't!
She whispered, finally turning to look at him. Her eyes were raw, her defenses stripped away.
Don't say you're sorry. Don't say it was a mistake. It's the only true thing that's happened to me since I left home.
He looked at her, and all the lies and pretenses fell away. He wasn't Jedediah Stone, the grieving widower. He wasn't her protector or her jailer. And she wasn't the runaway, the liar, the twin. They were just a man and a woman, stripped down to their essential, lonely selves in a crumbling shack in the middle of a vast wilderness. This time, she was the one who moved first. She leaned forward, her hand coming up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the rough line of his jaw. It was a gesture of profound, heartbreaking tenderness. Her eyes searched his, asking a question he knew he could no longer refuse to answer. She closed the small distance between them and kissed him. The kiss was not like the one in the rain. There was no anger in it, no desperation. It was slow, deep, and deliberate. It was a conscious choice, a quiet surrender to the truth that had been arcing between them from the very beginning. The kiss did not stop. It deepened, flowing from one to the other like a river breaking its banks, washing away everything but the here and now. His arms went around her, pulling her from her blanket and into his embrace. The world outside, Eleanor, the lies, the danger. It all ceased to exist. There was only the crackle of the fire, the rough floorboards beneath them, and the overwhelming, undeniable reality of their bodies finally coming together. He laid her down gently on the blanket he'd brought, its soft wool a small island of comfort on the hard-packed earth floor. In the flickering firelight, their lovemaking was a thing of stark, elemental beauty. It was both wild and tender, a raw claiming born of weeks of denial. There was a roughness to it, a desperate need to erase the space that had been forced between them, to feel nothing but skin and breath and the frantic beating of two hearts. His calloused hands, accustomed to the hardness of wood and leather, learned the soft, yielding geography of her body. Her touch was both fierce and gentle, an exploration of the lonely strength she found in him. It was a beautiful, terrible act, beautiful in its honesty and terrible in its betrayal. Every touch was infused with a sweet, aching pain. They were two transgressors finding a desperate, holy solace in the heart of their sin. They moved together with a rhythm that was both ancient and new, a dance of sorrow and desire. In that small, forgotten cabin, under the silent watch of the ancient woods, they gave each other the one thing neither of them had had for a very long time, a moment of pure, unvarnished truth. However damaging it might be, they clung to each other, not as saviors or sinners, but as two profoundly lonely people who had finally, against all odds, found their way home. The first light of dawn was filtering through the grimy window when Jed awoke. Clara was asleep in his arms, her face soft and peaceful in the gray light, the lines of worry momentarily erased. For the first time, she looked utterly free. A wave of tenderness so fierce it stole his breath washed over him. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he loved this woman, this difficult, brave, reckless woman. He also knew that he had shattered everything. He was gently stroking her hair when a floorboard creaked outside the door. He froze. Clara stirred beside him. The door swung open. Eleanor stood there. She was not disheveled from a night of worry. She was dressed neatly, her hair pinned up, as if she were paying a social call. Her face was calm, her eyes holding no surprise, only a deep, weary confirmation. Her gaze swept over the scene, the dying fire, the discarded clothes, the two of them tangled together on the blanket on the floor. She took it all in, her expression unchanging. She did not cry. She did not scream. Her control was absolute, and far more devastating than any outburst would have been. Clara sat up abruptly, pulling the blanket around herself, her face crumpling with shame.
Eleanor, she gasped, the word a strangled sob. I'm so sorry.
Eleanor's gaze shifted to her sister. There was no pity in it, only a cold, clear judgment. She looked from Clara's horrified face to Jed's grim one, and her lips thinned into a straight, hard line. "Then don't pretend you didn't choose," she said, her voice quiet, but each word landing like a perfectly aimed stone. Clara let out a choked cry and buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent, racking sobs. Eleanor watched her sister break for a moment longer, her own face an unreadable mask of stone. Then, without another word, she turned and walked away, disappearing from the doorway as silently as she had appeared, leaving the empty space and the sound of Clara's weeping behind her. The journey back to the ranch was the longest of Jed's life. Clara rode behind him, her arms wrapped around his waist, her face buried in his back. She had not stopped crying. He said nothing, offering the silent comfort of his presence, but he knew it was not enough. The bond between the two sisters, the fierce, protective love that had set this entire tragedy in motion, had been broken, and he was the man who had broken it. When they arrived, the cabin was empty. Eleanor was gone. But not just her person. Her presence. Her book of poetry was gone from the mantel. Her silver-backed brush was gone from the small table. It was as if she had never been there at all. But she hadn't gone far. Jed found her sitting on a fallen log at the edge of the woods, staring out at the vast, empty plains. She did not look at him as he approached. Before he could speak, the sound of approaching horses made them both turn. It was not the sheriff this time. It was 3 men, riding hard. The man in the lead was stout and florid-faced, dressed in an expensive suit that was out of place in the wilderness. His eyes were small and cruel. Jed recognized him from descriptions he'd heard. Alistair Finch. The 2 men with him were not townsfolk. They were hard-faced men with guns holstered low on their hips. They were hired muscle. The rumors had finally reached Blackwater Gulch. The jilted groom had come to collect his property. Finch reined in his horse, his piggy eyes fixing on Eleanor. A slow, unpleasant smile spread across his face. "Well, well, there you are, my dear. I see you found some rustic accommodations." His gaze shifted, taking in Jed, and then Clara, who had just emerged from the cabin, her face pale and tear-streaked. His smile widened. "And you've made friends. How charming." He swung down from his horse. "I've paid a good price for you. Miss Vance, the contract is signed. You belong to me." Jed stepped forward, placing himself between Finch and the 2 sisters. "She belongs to no one. You're not welcome on this land. Get out." Finch laughed, a short, ugly bark. "This land?" He gestured to his 2 gunmen, who were already dismounting, their hands resting on the butts of their pistols. "This land will be the last thing you see if you don't step aside." "Rancher." Jed stood his ground, his body tense. He was unarmed, his own gun belt hanging inside the cabin. He looked from Finch's cruel face to the cold eyes of his hired guns. He looked back at the 2 women standing behind him. Eleanor, her face a mask of defiant terror. Clara, her eyes wide, her hand reaching for her sister's. In that moment, the lies, the betrayals, the jealousies, they all burned away, leaving only a single and stark reality. These were his, to protect, to defend. He was forced to protect the 2 women he had come to love, each in their own profoundly different way. The world narrowed to the space between Jedediah and the 3 men. The air was unnaturally still, the recent drama of tears and confessions silenced by the immediate, metallic threat of violence. Alistair Finch's face was a mask of smug ownership, his hired guns loose and ready beside him. Behind Jed, he could feel the presence of the 2 sisters, a fragile warmth at his back. He was a single,
unarmed man standing as a bulwark against the brutal certainty of a signed contract and the guns hired to enforce it. "This is my last offer. Rancher," Finch sneered, taking a step forward. "Step aside. The woman is my property. I have a bill of sale to prove it." "She's a human being," Jed said, his voice a low growl. His eyes darted between the two gunmen. The one on the right was older, his face a roadmap of hard living, his eyes cold and professional. The one on the left was younger, fidgety, his hand hovering nervously over his pistol. He was the weak link. "She is what the law says she is," Finch retorted. "And the law says she is mine. Boys, persuade this farmer to see reason, then fetch me my bride." The two men began to spread out, flanking him. It was a classic pincer move, designed to divide his attention. He knew his only chance was the Colt Peacemaker hanging on its peg just inside the cabin door, a lifetime away. He braced himself, ready to charge, to fight, to die, when a blur of movement from the cabin caught his eye. It was Clara. She had slipped back inside while Finch was monologuing. "Now!" She reappeared in the doorway, and in her hands was Jed's Winchester rifle. She held it with a grim determination, the stock pressed awkwardly against her shoulder, the long barrel wavering slightly, but her finger was on the trigger. Finch's men froze, their easy confidence evaporating. The odds had just changed. Finch's face purpled with rage. "Put that down, you foolish girl, before you hurt someone!" Clara's voice, when she spoke, was as steady as a rock. "Get off this land, now!" The older gunman slowly began to raise his pistol, his eyes locked on Clara. He saw an amateur, an easy target, but just as his knuckles whitened, another figure moved. It was not Clara, and it was not Jed, it was Eleanor. In a move of startling, unexpected courage, she stepped out from behind Jed. She didn't cower or plead. She walked forward until she stood directly in front of his body, a human shield in a simple cotton dress. She faced Alistair Finch, her chin held high, her eyes blazing with a fire no one had ever seen there before. The woman who had spent her life trying to be invisible was now making herself the undeniable center of the world. "You are mistaken, Mr. Finch," she said, her voice clear and ringing, carrying across the clearing with the authority of a queen. "No one owns me." She took another step, her gaze sweeping over him and his hired guns with utter contempt. "I am not a parcel to be bought. I am not a debt to be collected, and I am not a contract to be enforced. I am a free woman, and I am not afraid to die free." The sheer force of her declaration stunned everyone into a moment of silence. The gunman stared. Finch's jaw hung slack. Even Jed was momentarily captivated by the transformation. This was the woman who had confessed she just wanted to escape. Here, now. She was not running. She was a fortress. That moment was all Jed needed. He moved, a blur of motion, shoving Eleanor safely behind him as he dove to the side, rolling toward the cabin door. "Clara, down!" he yelled. Clara dropped to the porch as the older gunman, recovering his senses, fired. The shot went wide, splintering the door frame where her head had been moments before. Jed snatched the rifle from her hands, the familiar weight of the weapon settling into his shoulder like a long-lost part of himself. He cocked the lever in a single fluid motion. The younger gunman panicked. He drew his pistol and fired wildly, the bullet kicking up dirt near Jed's boots. Jed didn't hesitate. He sighted down the barrel, the world shrinking to the space between the hammer and the man's chest. He squeezed the trigger. The rifle's report was a deafening crack that echoed off the trees. The younger gunman grunted, a look of surprise on his face, before he crumpled to the ground. The older gunman, seeing his partner fall and seeing the cold, deadly competence in Jed's eyes, made a swift calculation. This was not the easy job he'd been paid for. He holstered his pistol, turned, and ran for his horse without a backward glance. He spurred the animal into a gallop and disappeared into the trees. Alistair Finch stood alone,
his face a comical mask of shock and terror. He looked at the dead man on the ground, at Jed advancing on him with a smoking rifle, and at the two women standing on the porch, both watching him with expressions of cold fury. The fight had gone out of him completely. He scrambled back to his horse, his dignity forgotten, and hauled his considerable bulk into the saddle. "This isn't over! Stone!" he shrieked, his voice cracking. "I'll have the law on you for this! You'll all hang!" He yanked the reins and galloped away, following his cowardly gunmen. An unnerving silence descended upon the clearing, broken only by the whistling of the wind and the buzzing of flies. The smell of gunpowder and blood hung heavy in the air. Jed stood over the body of the man he had killed, the rifle heavy in his hands. He felt no triumph, only a deep, hollow weariness. Behind him, he heard Clara begin to sob, the delayed shock of the violence hitting her. Eleanor, however, was calm. She walked over to the body, her face pale but resolute, and then turned to Jed. "You must ride to town," she said, her voice steady. "You must tell Sheriff Brody what happened. It must be you who tells it, before Finch can spin his lies." Jed nodded, his mind slowly beginning to work again. She was right. He had to get ahead of this. He sent the sisters inside, telling them not to touch anything, and rode the long, grim journey into Harmony Creek. The aftermath was as messy as Eleanor had predicted. Sheriff Brody and a deputy rode back with him, asked 100 questions, and took the body away. Jed told the truth, simply and plainly. He was defending his home and the two women under his protection. It was a clear case of self-defense. But Alistair Finch had gotten to town first. He had not gone to the sheriff, but to the saloon and the general store, spreading his own version of the story. A story of a homesteader who had stolen his promised bride and was now living with her and her twin sister in sin. A story of a crazed recluse who had murdered one of his men in cold blood. The law, after a brief investigation, officially cleared Jedediah of any wrongdoing, but society was a different kind of jury, and it delivered a much harsher verdict. The next time the three of them rode into town for supplies, the change was palpable. Conversation stopped when they entered the general store. Women would pull their children close and cross the street to avoid them. Men would stare from the porch of the saloon, their eyes a mixture of contempt and prurient curiosity. The whispers followed them everywhere, as persistent and irritating as horseflies. "There he is, the cowboy who lives with the two sisters." "That's her, the runaway bride, no better than she ought to be. They say—" Heard the sisters were fighting over him like a pair of cats in heat. Shot a man for it. They had become pariahs, the subjects of scandalous gossip, a local legend of sin and violence. Jed, who had always been an outsider, felt the sting of their judgment more keenly now that it included the women. Clara, who had always railed against society's rules, found the reality of being an outcast to be a heavy, suffocating burden. But it was Eleanor who seemed to suffer the most, the woman who had been raised to value reputation and standing above all else, now had none. She would walk through town with her head held high, her face a mask of indifference. But Jed could see the toll it was taking in the dark circles under her eyes. One morning, about a week after the shooting, Jed woke to find her packing a small cloth bag in the pre-dawn light. The cabin was cold and silent. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice quiet. She didn't look at him. "I'm leaving." "Leaving? To where? You have nowhere to go." "I'll find somewhere," she said, her voice tight with unshed tears. "I am the cause of all this. Jedediah, the rumors, the shooting, the shame. Finch came for me. The town is shunning you because of me. If I leave, perhaps in time, they will leave you and Clara in peace." He got out of his bed and walked over to her, his bare feet silent on the cold floorboards. He stood before her, blocking her path. "You think this is about you?" "Of course it is," she cried, finally looking at him, her composure breaking. "I am the runaway bride. I am the ruined woman.
I bring trouble wherever I go. I have destroyed my sister's life, and now I am destroying yours." He reached out and took her hand, his grip gentle but firm, stopping her from packing. Her hand was trembling in his. "Eleanor, look at me." He waited until her glistening eyes met his. "Before you came here, this cabin was a tomb. I was a ghost. I hadn't had a real conversation in 5 years. I worked until I was too tired to dream. You and Clara, you brought this place back to life. You brought me back to life." He took a deep breath, the words coming hard, dredged up from a place of deep, guarded honesty. "What I feel for Clara it's a fire, it's wild, and it's true. But what I feel for you is true, too. You're brave and you're smart, and you have a strength in you that could move mountains. You're not just someone I saved. Eleanor, you're someone I love too." He saw the shock in her eyes. It wasn't the love of a husband, or the passionate love of a suitor. He knew she understood that. It was something different, something new. It was the love of a man for the woman who had, with her quiet intelligence and fierce spirit, become an indispensable part of his world. It was the love of family. A sob escaped her lips, and she sank onto the bed, her face in her hands. A floorboard creaked. Clara stood in the doorway, having heard everything. Her face was soft with an emotion Jed had not seen there before, a complete absence of jealousy. She walked over and sat beside her sister, her own eyes full of tears. She didn't say anything at first. She just reached out and silently took Eleanor's free hand. Eleanor looked up, her face wet, her eyes full of confusion and sorrow. "He's right," Clara said, her voice a whisper. "We were never meant to fight. Eleanor, not over him, not over anything." She squeezed her sister's hand. "We're meant to survive. We always have been. Together." That single word, together, hung in the air, filled with the weight of their entire lives. It was a promise, an absolution, and a new beginning. Eleanor looked from her sister's earnest face to Jed's, and for the first time in a long time, she allowed a small, fragile smile to touch her lips. She was not leaving. This strange, broken, besieged place was her home. That night marked a turning point. The weight of the lies, the secrets, and the betrayals had been lifted, replaced by a raw, fragile truth. The three of them sat before the hearth, the fire casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. There was no pretense left. The town outside had branded them as sinners, and in their exile, they found a strange and profound freedom, the freedom to be honest. For the first time, they truly talked. Jed went first. His voice was low and rough, unaccustomed to bearing the weight of his past. He told them about Mary and their son, Thomas. He spoke of the fire, not just the flames, but the suffocating silence that had followed. A silence so complete he thought it would swallow him whole. He confessed that their arrival had been like the first rain after a decade of drought, a chaotic, messy, life-giving storm that had woken him from a long, living death. Then Eleanor spoke. She told them of her childhood, of feeling like a porcelain doll on a shelf, admired but never touched. Her future a path laid out in stones she had not chosen. She confessed her secret, desperate desire not for a grand romance, but for a small, simple life where her own thoughts were the loudest thing in the room. She admitted that in their ruse, in pretending to be his wife, she had felt a sense of safety and belonging she had never known, and it had both terrified and thrilled her. Finally, it was Clara's turn. She spoke of what it was like to be the storm to Eleanor's calm, the weed to her sister's rose. She confessed the deep, burning jealousy she had felt, a jealousy born from a lifetime of feeling second best. She told them how her plan to save Eleanor had been selfish, too. It was her own rebellion, her own desperate attempt to break free. And she looked at Jed, her eyes clear and honest in the firelight, and told him she had seen in his own solitude a mirror of her own. a wildness he kept locked away that she had recognized instantly. Words poured out of them, a flood of past pains, secret shames, and unspoken desires. They talked until the fire burned down to glowing embers and the moon was high in the sky. They were no longer the cowboy, the proper twin, and the wild twin. They were just Jed, Eleanor, and Clara, three damaged, lonely people who had been thrown together by fate and forged into something new by fire. As the last of the embers glowed in the hearth, a comfortable silence settled over them. They were sitting close together on the bearskin rug, not touching, but drawing warmth and strength from each other's presence. The world outside could whisper and condemn, but inside the four walls of this small cabin, they had found a strange, unlikely sanctuary. They were three survivors, adrift in the vast wilderness of their lives, who had finally, in the deepest darkness, found the shore in each other. A year passed. Spring returned to the high plains, not with the hesitant pastels of the east, but with a fierce, defiant explosion of life. The land, scarred by sun and wind, erupted in a sea of purple lupine and fiery Indian paintbrush. The air, once thick with dust and tension, was now sweet with the scent of pine and thawing earth. The ranch that had been a refuge, then a cage, then a crucible, had finally become a home. The seasons had changed, and so had they. The small, desperate homestead had grown. Jedediah, with a strength no longer fueled by grief but by purpose, had cleared another 20 acres. The herd was larger, healthier. He had built a new, sturdier corral and added a lean-to on the barn. The physical expansion of the ranch was a mirror to the expansion of his own heart. The silence he had once cultivated as a shield was now a comfortable peace, filled not with ghosts, but with the sounds of a life being actively lived. Clara, the woman who had run into a storm, had found her stillness in the patient, humming world of bees. Behind the cabin, near the edge of the woods, stood a row of white-painted hives. This was her domain. She moved among the swarming insects with a calm, fearless grace that amazed Jed. Dressed in his old trousers and a veiled hat, she was a priestess tending her flock. She harvested the honey, a liquid gold that tasted of wildflowers and freedom, and rendered the wax into candles and balms. The wild, restless energy that had once threatened to tear her apart had been channeled into creation. She was no longer running from anything. She was cultivating life. And Eleanor, the woman who had been raised to be an ornament, had discovered the profound power of her own mind. She had found her purpose not in a husband's home, but in the eager faces of children who had never been taught their letters. Twice a week, families from the poorer, more isolated homesteads, families who were themselves outcasts, ignored by the pious society of Harmony Creek, would send their children to the stone ranch, in the main room of the cabin, which now smelled of chalk dust and old paper. Eleanor taught reading, writing, and arithmetic. She was patient, firm, and brilliant. She had taken the refinement that had once been her cage and turned it into a key, unlocking worlds for children who had known nothing but the hard dirt of their own small lives. They were an island. The town of Harmony Creek still watched them, still whispered. The story of the recluse, the runaway bride, and her wild twin had become a permanent part of the local lore, a cautionary tale told by mothers and a lewd joke shared by men in the saloon. They were shunned, but they had learned that being shunned by a world you never truly belonged to was not a punishment, but a liberation. They needed nothing from the town. They had their land, their work, and each other. They moved in a quiet, intricate orbit, a three-body system held together by a gravity of its own making. They were three broken pieces of separate lives that, when fitted together, had somehow made a new and more resilient whole. Three disparate notes that, when played together, created a strange and beautiful chord. Jed would watch them sometimes, a feeling of profound, aching gratitude swelling in his chest until he felt it might burst. He would see Clara, her face lit with concentration as she inspected a frame from one of her hives, and he would be struck by her fierce, earthy beauty. The fire was still in her, But now it was a hearth fire, a source of warmth and light. And then he would see Eleanor, a gentle smile on her face as she guided a child's hand to form a letter, and he would be moved by her quiet, unshakable strength. She was the anchor, the calm center around which their wilder world turned. One afternoon, a traveling peddler, a man named Silas, whose route took him to the most isolated homesteads, stopped at the ranch. He was a cheerful, wizened man who traded in gossip as much as in pots and pans. As Jed helped him water his horse, Silas looked from the tidy cabin to the neat rows of beehives and then to the small group of children reciting their letters on the porch with Eleanor. "You've built quite a life for yourself out here." "Stone," Silas said, his eyes twinkling with curiosity. "A man could do worse. A man could do a whole lot worse." He chewed on his tobacco for a moment. "But folks do talk. They see two beautiful women, and they don't see a school or a honey business. Forgive me for asking direct, but are you married?" Jed stopped what he was doing and looked out over his land. He saw Clara walking from the hives, her veil pushed back, a smudge of soot on her cheek. He saw Eleanor on the porch, her face illuminated by the pride of a child who had just read his first full sentence. He thought of the long, silent years in the tomb this place had been, and the chaotic, painful, beautiful storm of life they had brought into it. A slow smile spread across his face, a genuine smile that reached the deep, quiet corners of his eyes. He turned back to the peddler. "I have two women who saved me from loneliness," he said, his voice simple and direct. "That's more than a marriage." Silas stared at him for a long moment. Then he let out a short, surprised laugh and shook his head. "Well, that's an answer a man can't argue with." He tipped his hat. "Godspeed to you all. Stone, you've got more riches here than any man in Harmony Creek." That evening, a special kind of quiet settled over the ranch. It was the eve of the anniversary of the storm that had first brought Clara to his door. They did not speak of it, but they all felt it. It was a day to be marked, not as a memory of terror, but as the beginning of their real lives. A private celebration was in order. There was an unspoken agreement. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in strokes of orange and violet, they began their ritual. Clara emerged from the small room that had been added onto the back of the cabin. She was wearing the dress she had first arrived in, the blue silk one. She and Eleanor had painstakingly mended it over the winter. The tears were gone, replaced by careful, almost invisible stitches. On her, it was no longer the dress of a terrified runaway. It was a symbol of her survival, a testament to her journey. Eleanor, meanwhile, moved through the cabin, lighting the beeswax candles that Clara had made. She placed them on the mantel, on the windowsills, on the table, until the room was filled with a soft, flickering, honey-scented glow that banished the shadows to the far corners. She set the table not with their usual tin plates, but with the small set of porcelain her mother had given her, a treasure she had kept wrapped in cloth at the bottom of her trunk. Jed came in from outside, his arms full of wildflowers. He had gathered them from the meadow, great bunches of purple lupine and bright yellow daisies. He arranged them in tin cans and glass jars, his large, rough hands surprisingly gentle. The wild, untamed beauty of the prairie filled the room. They ate a simple meal, but it felt like a feast. They spoke little, their communication flowing in the quiet smiles, the shared glances, the easy way they passed the bread and poured the water. The years of pain and misunderstanding had been stripped away, leaving only this core of profound, unconditional acceptance. After they had cleared the plates, Jed stood up and held out his hands, not to one, but to both of them. Clara took his right hand, Eleanor his left. He led them to the center of the room, to the worn bearskin rug before the hearth. There was no music, save for the crackling of the fire and the song of the crickets outside. He turned first to Clara. He pulled her close, his hand resting on the small of her back. She came into his arms as if she had been born there. They began to dance. A slow, simple shuffle. Their bodies remembered a different kind of dance, one of passion and desperation in a crumbling shack. This was different. This was a dance of peace, of homecoming. He buried his face in her hair, inhaling the familiar scent of sunshine and beeswax, and felt the steady, reassuring beat of her heart against his chest. After a few moments, he released her and turned to Eleanor. She came to him with a quiet grace. He took her in his arms, his touch gentle, reverent. Their dance was different, too. It was a waltz of the mind and spirit. With Eleanor, he felt a profound sense of calm, of intellectual partnership. She rested her head on his shoulder, and he felt the weight of her trust, a trust she had given to no one before. He was not just her protector. He was her confidant, her equal. Then, he stepped back and let the two sisters face each other. They looked at one another in the warm candlelight, and all the years of rivalry and shadow fell away. They saw only their other half, the person who knew them better than anyone else in the world. They took each other's hands, and for a moment, they danced together, a slow, circling movement of perfect, mirrored grace. It was a dance of forgiveness, of reunion, of a bond that had been tested by fire and had emerged unbreakable. They needed no preacher to sanctify their union. They needed no piece of paper from the state. They needed no witnesses from a town that had condemned them. In the golden light of the candles, surrounded by the beauty they had cultivated from the wilderness, they made their own vows in the silent language of their hearts. Their sacrament was love. Their creed was understanding. Their only law was freedom. Later, when the fire had burned low and the candles had dripped into pools of fragrant wax, they lay down together on the great bearskin rug. Eleanor lay in the middle, her head pillowed on Jed's arm. Clara curled up on her other side, her back pressed against her sister's. Jed's free hand found Clara's, and their fingers intertwined. Eleanor's hand came to rest on top of theirs, her fingers covering them both. A single unified knot of 3 lives. Outside, the wind whispered through the tall pines, a sound that was no longer lonely, but was now a lullaby. The vast, dark expanse of the west, which had once seemed so harsh and threatening, was just their home. A quiet, sleeping giant that held them safely in its hand. The world could judge, but it could not touch them here. In the warm, breathing silence, they no longer had to run, they no longer had to hide. Their love, forged in a storm and tempered by fire, was unconventional, impossible, and against every rule they had ever been taught. But as they lay there, their hands and hearts intertwined in the quiet dark, it was the only truth they had left to hold, and it was enough. Thank you for listening to this story. We're building a community around these tales from the American West, and we'd love to know who we're sharing them with. Please, leave a comment below and let us know where in the world you're listening from. It's always a thrill to see how far these stories travel. If you enjoyed it, please consider subscribing to our channel, From Wild West, and share your thoughts. Your voice is a part of our campfire.